All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. I think we're off to a good start after the unpleasantness of yesterday afternoon. But we are back. You are at the 17th annual Satchmo SummerFest, presented by Chevron. Give yourselves a hand for being here with us. I would like to make note of those sponsors of the Symposium aspect of the festival. They include the Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation, the Joseph and Inez Eichenbaum Foundation, with Stephen Maitland-Lewis and Joni Berry, Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the Midlow Center at the University of New Orleans, Harrah's New Orleans, Richie and Vicky Norregan, the Ruth Fertel Foundation, and Beverlo Glass and Electric Lights. Give them all a hand of applause for making this possible. And now, When Lewis Came Home, Part 2, Reflections on Civil Rights. This continues a conversation started last year, not on this same stage, but the idea is the same stage. And we have Bruce Rayburn, who has been part of this festival since its inception. He's a longtime curator of the Hogan Jazz Archive at Tulane University and the director of special collections there. He's a specialist in New Orleans jazz and jazz historiography and the author of New Orleans Style and the Writing of New Orleans Jazz, Mr. Bruce Rayburn. And all the way from Sweden, Bjorn Barnheim is celebrating the 50th anniversary of his initial visit to New Orleans in 1967, and his appearance here today for this trip marks his 41st trip from Sweden to New Orleans. Give him a hand for that. He was the first vice president of the Swedish Jazz Museum and the curator of its archive. A recent contribution he made to Tulane University has made possible the Bjorn Barnheim Research Fellowship for visiting scholars to conduct research at the Hogan Jazz Archive. We are pleased to have him. Mr. Bjorn Barnheim.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to be here. This is such a wonderful time of year, even with the downpours. Spirit of Satch keeps us going through all of it. We have some slides that we're going to share, but they're not necessarily to be read. We're going to be talking about the content, but the reason we're using these slides is so that you'll be aware of the documentation that has been discovered by Bjorn in the research he's been doing. And so this is round 2 of an ongoing project that he's been doing for several years now. And we're learning so many new things based on the hard work he's putting into it. So this first slide is actually a picture from the Municipal Auditorium with an All-Stars concert in 1952. And I'm going to just read the last line. It appeared in the New Orleans Jazz Club's periodical journal, the second line. And this will give you an idea of some of the things that Armstrong is dealing with in the period from 1949 up until 1971 when we lose him. Notice Marty Napoleon Muggan at the piano while Barney Bigard belches from too much crawfish bisque and boredom. And then the footer is, what price commercial glory? And they don't even bother to put a question mark on that. It's just sort of a statement that Armstrong's aesthetics are in the wrong place for traditional jazz purists in New Orleans. And they panned that concert. But we're going to look at some other aspects that aren't just about the music, but particularly about civil rights. Bjorn has documented 19 trips back to New Orleans. We covered 1931 through 1949 last year, and we're going to take it from 49 again, but we're going to be putting the emphasis in a different place. Our intention is to show the continuous involvement of Louis Armstrong in addressing the obstacles that racism and segregation placed in his path. In other words, 1957 is not an anomaly. that Armstrong was basically, every trip back to New Orleans, was dealing with racial situations and was coping with them in a continuous manner, although sometimes in such a subtle manner that the intensity of what he was bringing to bear was not recognized. Because besides being under aesthetic attack in this period, many critics in the black press are taking him to fault for playing for racially segregated audiences and for basically being too soft on the race issue. We happen to disagree with that characterization. Bjorn, let's start with the Booker T. Washington concert. When he's King Zulu in 1949, there were some problems in finding a venue that would accommodate what was a racially mixed band. He had Jack Teagarden on trombone. Tell us a little bit about this performance.
He was supposed to be in the municipal auditorium, but they denied because this integral group. And they chose this Booker T. Washington auditorium instead. And that was okay for Teagarden. But the funny thing is, in the program, Teagarden was spelled T-Garden.
T apostrophe?
Yeah.
Should also point out that it was a racially mixed audience at Booker T. Washington, that Hugues Panassier, the esteemed French critic, was there with his companion, Madeleine Gauthier. Don Perry of the New Orleans Jazz Club was there, and Leonard Feather as well. Armstrong's appearance as King Zulu, which he considered to be a great honor, did not fly well in the black press. This is a clipping from the Chicago Defender, and let me just extract a little bit. First of all, they refer to the Zulu parade as Jim Crow's side of Mardi Gras. I think anyone in New Orleans knows that the Black Carnival in New Orleans is a preference within the black community. It's not something that's relegated to them by whites. It is a separate celebration, a separate way of celebrating carnival. So that characterization as though blacks were forced to have a separate carnival of their own because of Jim Crow is not entirely accurate. They also take Armstrong to task, quote, grotesquely made up Armstrong, unrecognizable, ending on a queer note because of the blackface involved in Zulu. And they also castigate him for being one of the few top-flight Negro entertainers who has not announced that he will bypass the Crescent City because of its Jim Crow.
But at the same time, it was a childhood's dream for Louis to be king of the Zulu. And in 1926, he made a recording called King of the Zulus.
The insider-outsider perspectives when it comes to New Orleans culture is something that we're constantly working on. I think that's one of the reasons the app that Randy and company were talking about in the previous presentation is so important, because it does provide an insider's perspective on New Orleans culture. And so things like blackface in Zulu can be misinterpreted in the Chicago Defender, but the point is it's also under attack in the Louisiana Weekly. They are talking about the People's Defense League denouncing the use of blackface by Armstrong as a disgraceful spectacle and degrading, which again sort of overlooks the whole spirit of caricature that is built into New Orleans Carnival. Carnival is the one day when you are allowed to sort of do the forbidden. But there's another side to the Zulu Ball that's not the public spectacle that people in Chicago or even the People's Defense League are reacting to, and that is the internal dynamics that drive what that social organization is all about. And that's a very different image to play with. This is a photograph by Nick Galliano. Bjorn has a long-standing friendship with Nick. And pictured are Leonard Feather, Armstrong, and Tex Stevens. This is from the Orrin Blackstone collection at the Hogan Jazz Archive. Tell us a little bit about Tex's insight into Armstrong's approach to dealing or deflecting racial issues.
In 1949, I think Tex was quite short time in the Zulu Club, but he was appointed to be the chauffeur for Louis during the stay 4 days in New Orleans. And they became very good friends, and every time Louis came back to town, they met.
Well, Bruce, you go back to say, is that Bernice with the crown? Yes, that's Louis with the crown on.
Yeah, there was
Standing
the
next to
crowning
Tex.
ceremony at the Booker T. Washington. This photo was taken.
It should also be pointed out that along with Vernon Winslow, Tex Stevens was one of the first black DJs to sort of integrate the airwaves in New Orleans in the late 1940s. So he did more than announce visiting jazz stars like Louis Armstrong. This is a statement that Tex made in 2009 when he was interviewed at Times-Picayune. And I think the way we need to interpret that is that Armstrong really tried to work around racial issues rather than confront them head on. There were ways of subverting that intent that were maybe a little bit required more finesse and maybe weren't as politically obvious, but maybe even more effective in some cases, certainly. Now, this is a time post-World War II when attitudes about race are changing, and there's a certain intolerance to segregation. Black servicemen in World War II put their lives on the line to combat fascism globally. They certainly didn't want to return to apartheid if they could help it. And so things are beginning to change, but they're changing very slowly in the 1940s. For example, we look at what's going on with the American Federation of Musicians in 1944. The status quo is Jim Crow. Ingrid Monson has written on this topic, and out of 673 AFM locals, there were 2 that were integrated in 1944. Can anyone tell me what they were? One of them should be quite obvious. It's in New York City,
New York.
802. The other one was Local 5 in Detroit. Those were the only 2. There were battles already going on in places like San Francisco to try to achieve integration, but it took a long time. New Orleans unions did not integrate until 1969-70.
Los Angeles was April 1st, 53.
Mm-hmm. But people within the industry were beginning to take on Jim Crow. And Norman Granz was mentioned yesterday by Dan and others for the great work he did with the duets of Ella and Louis. But in the late 1940s, he was pushing an agenda for jazz at the Philharmonic, and he looked into bringing jazz at the Philharmonic to the Municipal Auditorium, which obviously in 49 would not take an integrated band with Jack Teagarden and Louis Armstrong playing together. But they did a song and dance with Norman Granz. But tell us a little bit about what went down when Granz tried to bring jazz at the Philharmonic to New Orleans.
He tried to hire the Municipal Auditorium, but he had the clause in his contract that all tickets should be sold to everybody, and there should not be any integrated or separated seats. And next picture is the clause for, yeah, there it is. That must be, and Norman didn't accept Municipal Hall, so he came back, I think it was 2 years later, to Washington, Booker T. Washington Auditorium.
Mm-hmm. What Norman Granz is doing is leveraging economic power to try to combat racial segregation. And you know, if you want to segregate your audience, you're going to he's going to cancel on you, and you're also going to give him half of the upfront money. And I think Armstrong had an agenda that was perhaps deeply hidden. No one ever talks about Louis Armstrong and reparations, for example. But if you look at the amount of money he exacted from the white community globally, I think there's actually something to work with there. So Armstrong comes to play Municipal Auditorium, which Grants has already checked off his list as being irreconcilable with an integration agenda. And so how Armstrong behaves in this situation is an interesting thing to look at from that perspective. How is he going to handle this situation? He's already been taken to task by the Chicago Defender for playing Jim Crow cities like New Orleans. But what actually goes down? Municipal Auditorium in 1952. Keep in mind that he's got a young white band opening for him. So they will be playing on the same stage, but they can't play at the same time. They can't actually be on the stage together under the segregation laws. And, you know, any musician knows that there's a whole thing about support and opening acts, and there's like a political hierarchy that goes with that. In this case, we're talking about a hierarchy which the support role is being played by these white musicians. They didn't seem to resent it one bit because they were playing with Louis Armstrong. Bjorn, tell us about this picture, because I know you're very curious about this situation and any documents that might have been generated from it.
Tony Almerico had a broadcast, and he was interviewing Louis. I've tried to find this interview, but nobody seems to have it. It would be interesting because it's just after he returned from 49 and the experience of the Jim Crow at that time. If he talked about it or not, I don't know.
So this is one of the things we're hoping to find, an artifact related to this interview, and see what they were talking about. Myra Menville was obviously very important. She was the secretary for many years in the New Orleans Jazz Club. She was also a member of the Uptown Social Elite, New Orleans. She had Confederate senators and mayors and whatnot in her family tree, and she was a dedicated jazz lover. We really would love to eavesdrop on this conversation. But there was a certain amount of activity surrounding the return of Armstrong in 1952. This picture, I think that the photographs will really take us places that the text might not reveal what we're really looking for here. Armstrong's involved in a lot of honorific things, like unveiling a life-sized portrait of Leon Rapolo, an early Sicilian jazz soloist. But this picture of Lizzie Miles, who was one of the first female vocalists to really travel and leave New Orleans, big impact. By the mid-1920s, she had already been to Europe and come back. She recorded with Jelly Roll Morton, with Joe Oliver in the 20s. And you can see he's very happy to see her. But Sid DeVilla, the club owner, is also there too. And so what the photographs are telling us is in this segregated environment, there's a lot of race mixing going on among people who want to be together. And that certainly included the opening act. I think, Bjorn, tell us a little bit about this, this photograph. This is provided by the Louisiana State Museum. There are a lot of happy faces in this picture, and I think originally
Except
you thought
one.
the guy in the back left looks worried, but everybody else is really sort of glad to be there. And I don't know if that's Jeff Riddick. Well, we don't want to know who that is anyway. But the point is, if you look at the expressions on the faces, all the All-Stars, Armstrong, and the Basin Street Six, they're very happy to be together. And I think originally you had wondered if this was backstage because of the prohibition of race mixing on the stage. But this is on stage. The audience is not there yet, but they are all on stage. You can see the juxtaposition of the drum set and the piano is the same as what we saw on the first slide, which shows them performing at the Municipal Auditorium.
But normally, I guess, it's so in Sweden anyway, that when you have several groups playing at one concert, they finish the last number together on the stage. This was not possible this time. There is a recording of this concert, only the Armstrong part, but there is no Pete Fountain or George Gerard or anyone.
And that was the limit he was up against. But I think what hopefully you'll conclude at the end of this presentation is that incrementally, Armstrong is becoming radicalized over this period on the issue of race, that the more he's confronted with this kind of injustice, the more he reacts to it. He begins in a very subtle way, the same way he did in 1931 when he dedicated I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You to the chief of the Memphis police force, who happened to be a grand wizard in the Ku Klux Klan, overseeing a rank and file that was about 70% Klan members. And, they just didn't get it. They didn't realize that he was playing the dozens with them. They thought it was a compliment. But in the 1950s, he really begins to, I think, the turbos kick in on these issues.
The date is 78.
The date of this is 1952.
May 52.
Yeah, that 1978 is just an accession number for Louisiana State Museum. That may be when they got it. Okay, so 1955, he comes back again. It's another trip. And this time, he's involved in television programs, quite a few.
There were 2 TV programs made in 6 days in New Orleans. On Sunday, it was the Colgate Comedy Hour, and that was filmed in French Quarter. And it was several groups in the program, and it was a celebration of the Mardi Gras. And Louis is playing one number inside the old Absinthe House, and then in the street he has a jazz battle with a white band standing on the balcony.
Just can't get away from race. Well, the big one is Horace Heidt, and Ricky in the past has shown this program, and it's very interesting because of the way it has sort of been misunderstood in the jazz literature, and so Bjorn's been trying to straighten that out. So this is the John P. Lyons Memorial Center, 624 Louisiana Avenue, which is in Central City. And this is the sponsor is the New Orleans Recreational Department, which becomes a key element in what happens as this television program plays out. Here's a photo of it, and you can see that the All-Stars are there in the back, and that basically this is an integrated television program that on this stage, at least, white and black performers can share the stage. But of course, there's some controversy about what's going on with the audience, which we'll get to in the beginning. But this is from Klaus Strateman, who has done a wonderful reference work on Armstrong's films. But there's a lot of ambiguity about this particular television program, and I think Bjorn has been able to straighten out some of that.
In every discography, it mentioned that Louis was single on the show. He didn't bring the All-Stars with him. But if you look at the picture, you can see Barney Bigard, Billy Key at the piano, Orville Shaw at the bass, and Termy Young is just visible.
Let me see a part of them.
So we can say that the All-Star was on the show.
But when they were auditioning the audience for the show, race became a huge factor in this. And ultimately, a very small number of blacks were admitted to the show, although some were. And this was largely because of resistance on the part of Nord. And it should be pointed out that the rationalization for this, because of segregation laws, quote, nothing could be done. This is 1955. The Brown versus Board of Education decision is 1954. So there's a little cultural lag time here. I guess that qualifies as backsliding into the future. But they integrated the program anyway. And I don't know if we can actually lay this at Horace Height's feet or Louis Armstrong's. I mean, Armstrong was hired to do a gig, but Horace Height certainly did not share the agenda of NORD, which was a segregationist agenda. And so the way it's presented in the press is that Horace Height pulls a fast one on New Orleans and manages to broadcast an integrated program from New Orleans despite stiff resistance. I think the phrase they use is, Height stages a perfect interracial show with Armstrong anyway. So let's talk about context a little bit, because 1950s is a time of change in New Orleans. During the 1950s, the population grew by 57,000. 52,000 were black. And so we're beginning to see a surge in the black population in New Orleans, and this is going to put pressure on the segregationist agenda in New Orleans. And we're going to see how Armstrong negotiates these changes. Now, Bjorn had asked, well, at what point does the population reach a black majority? In the 20th century, it doesn't. But at this time, we saw that for the auditions for the Horace Height show, about 10% of the audience was reserved for black attendance. In fact, the population in New Orleans was almost 31% black in 1950, and it goes up to about 33% in 1960. And 1960 is a pivotal year because that's when the desegregation crisis hits the public schools. Ruby Bridges and the rest of that throws things into high gear, and you really get more white flight in the 1960s than you do in the 50s. But in the 50s, you have this surge of population, which is driving a lot of activity and a lot of resistance. Because of the Horace Height show, another municipal auditorium concert was canceled, basically too close for comfort, I think was the way he put it.
Yeah.
It seems to me the difference between, a small number of performances on television and a full concert, that, this is not really a competitive situation. Maybe it was retaliatory, who knows. But Lewis does begin to kick in at this point. This is the so-called boycott phase of the 1950s. Armstrong's boycotts, so-called boycotts, are directed against something called the anti-mixing law, which was passed to deal with the aftermath of the Brown decision, to try to put the brakes on desegregation. You want to tell us a little bit about where Armstrong is fitting in all of this and the elements of the anti-mixing law?
I think the headline, Louis Armstrong boycotts New Orleans, is incorrect. It's the Louisiana law that boycott Armstrong's integrated All-Stars.
The anti-mixing law basically is prohibiting any sort of social interaction, musical or otherwise, between whites and blacks in New Orleans. So, you could get into the fine points of it, but it's pretty much a total prohibition. So you combine that on the local level with the Little Rock situation, and you have a much broader, deeper context for understanding why he blows his top over Little Rock. Now, the earlier critique by the Chicago Defender basically said other artists are not coming to New Orleans because of Jim Crow, but Armstrong still is. Well, at this point, Armstrong is leading the charge, and other artists who already were embracing this agenda are going to follow suit, are basically going to slipstream what Louis Armstrong is doing. This, of course, is from the Chicago Defender. And there's a reaction. Byline from Hattiesburg, Mississippi comes as no surprise. And it's an attempt at retaliation for Armstrong's so-called boycott of the South. As Bjorn has explained, it's really quite the contrary. Armstrong, because he's black and has an integrated band, is being told, you cannot perform here legally. Tell us a little bit about how it goes down with Eisenhower and the State Department, because there is some sort of reconciliation that takes place, and there's some jockeying around between the State Department that really does want to leverage Armstrong's international celebrity for its own purposes, and what happens after Ike sends in troops to back up integration in Little Rock.
I think it blasted when Louis saw his young black students trying to enter the school in Little Rock. And he blasted out in an interview. And the day after, his manager tried to cut it off. It was just an accident by Louis to say these words. But he more or less asked Eisenhower to go to a very hot place.
And we know that Lewis could push back against Glazer, too, when he felt it was necessary to do that. We heard that about Newport and Velma in the presentation that Maxine made yesterday.
And
So-
sorry.
Go ahead.
I can say also that one of the girls that tried to enter the school and succeeded later, she went to Chicago to study chemistry at the university. And there she met a boy from Sweden, and she's now living in Stockholm.
We're going to get into these Swedish connections next year.
She had a program on the Swedish radio last summer, and after talking about this Little Rock, she was playing one of Louis' version of Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen.
Well, this particular document is from Jet magazine in April 1958, and it shows that the State Department and Lewis have made up, and that Armstrong is going out there and sort of promoting the United States, in this case at the Brussels Fair, and that when it comes to popularity with European audiences, he outranks Benny Goodman and Count Basie, comes in first pretty much every time. But you still got this lingering battle with New Orleans going on. This is from October 1958. And this byline is not really accurate, is it, Bjorn?
No, I think you can't cancel a date you haven't accepted. If you read the article, it's an interview where he claimed New Orleans and Louisiana about this anti-mixing law. And he says, I can't go back as long as that is in charge.
And he's using the media to make a statement, in other words. It's not about a gig being canceled, it's about Armstrong wanting to weigh in on the issue. But if he's having problems with New Orleans, it doesn't concern the black community here, because he is making gifts available to the Milne Boys Home and also to playgrounds for black kids in Jefferson Parish, which will soon be the site of a good deal of white flight over the course of the 1960s and 70s.
So several times during the 50s and 60s, and even just a month before he died, he gave money to the Milne Boys Home, which were the successor of the Weiss Home.
Totally paying it forward. That's Armstrong. So this is one of the last bylines dealing with the boycott issue, because things are going to turn around in the 1960s. Although how do we interpret this one? Strictly ad-lib, downbeat, 1960. Oh, South Africa is boycotting Armstrong. They don't want him coming during his African tour. Well, duh. You know, apartheid and Armstrong by this time, I think, the way his stance on civil rights is being interpreted internationally through all of his press going up against Ike and the rest of it is, this guy is dangerous to apartheid. So I don't see that as low visibility on these issues. I see that as extremely high visibility. But they do make up. And so in 1965, Armstrong comes home again. And basically a contingent, I think, led by Helen Arlt from the New Orleans Jazz Club, goes up and begs him to come back, basically. And I think, you know, the sort of hit that New Orleans was taking by not having its most famous citizen of the world able to come and play back home the way he wanted to, was taking its toll. And it began to dawn on people, plus anyone who is deprived of Louis Armstrong's music for a long period is going to go through some major withdrawal. So here he is with an integrated band playing in New Orleans. Got Jewel Brown as his vocalist.
We can also mention that on the previous slide, he rested at the Royal Orleans Hotel between the visit to the Jazz Museum and the concert. And I think it was the first time he entered that building. But when he was there, they tried to get Punch Miller into the hotel, but he was denied to enter.
Change comes slow. Well, there were a number of sort of celebratory events surrounding his return home in 1965. So he definitely was given the red carpet treatment.
Yeah, both white and black organizations.
And old friends, of course, here he is with Peter Davis. Davis's mentoring at the Colored Waifs Home was, of course, crucial in expanding his horizons, just the right time for him to, you know, achieve takeoff as a musician and a vocalist. And with Helen Arlt as well. And to some extent, the reconciliation, you know, includes the Jazz Club, because it was the Jazz Club's concert at Municipal Auditorium that created problems for him in the first place. And one could always say, well, it was about the city and it was about the law and the socio-political situation in New Orleans. But the fact of the matter is, for a long time, the New Orleans Jazz Club was Jim Crow. Martin Williams called them on it. They didn't integrate their board until the early 1970s. And they had what was a sort of special membership for what they called corresponding members, which could include people of African heritage. But within the club, there were various competing factions. There were extreme conservatives, people like Tom Brown, for example, and there were radicalized integrationists like Johnny Wiggs, for example, and poor Edmond Souchon was caught in the middle. But they eventually worked that out, and they dropped the Jim Crow aspect of it. But like the Musicians Union here, that didn't get resolved until the early 1970s. Well, this is a reflection by Nat Hentoff on what it meant for Armstrong to come back. And the way he puts it is that Armstrong returned on his own egalitarian terms. And so there's no misinterpretation of where Armstrong's coming from. He fought for an ideal, which was an integrated New Orleans. And over the course of the 1950s and into the 60s, he made some progress on that issue.
You can see I've really tried to read every cultural magazine in US.
All right. Well, you don't look at the pictures in Playboy, though. I know that, Bjorn.
The cultural texts.
So, 1966, he's back again, Municipal Auditorium. He's able to bring the band he wants to bring. But you know, there's always going to be some trouble lurking around the corner for Louis Armstrong. Joe Segreto does not like something he read in Satchmo My Life in New Orleans, and so he brings a $100,000 suit against Louis Armstrong based on defamation of character or something. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Armstrong claimed in the book that he was one of the biggest pimps in New Orleans in the 1910s. And it's funny, this zoo was made 12 years after the book was published, and the day after he left New Orleans.
And this is the Joe Segreto who became Louis Prima's manager, who wasn't, I don't think, he might have been an infant in 1910, but the person referred to in the book, it's a Sicilian club, saloon, might be family related, but it's not the same individual at all. We'll hand that to a lawyer and they will find something to do with it. This particular proposed concert never happened.
It was cancelled because of rain. It was an outdoor in City Park and was supposed to be for the young people of New Orleans. And Louis was making this appearance free of charge.
And on the program was Alfred E. Newman and the Mad Men. I mean, who wouldn't want to see them? Well, we're coming to the end of the line. 1968, this is Armstrong's final performance in New Orleans, Jazz Fest 68. And again, you know, things were not perfect in New Orleans. The board meetings that produced Jazz Fest 68, the forerunner of the Jazz and Heritage Festival that we know today, there were problems about whether or not Local 496, the black local, was getting adequate representation in the programming. And Danny Barker was sitting in on those meetings, and he was one of the people complaining the loudest because he felt that the way this particular program was being organized, blacks were being excluded systematically from it. That's why in 1969 they bring in Willis Conover to try to mollify that situation. And they were already in conversation with George Wein, and Wein had refused to get involved because he was married to an African-American woman, and he didn't like the racial situation that he found in New Orleans. But in 68 and 69, I think they lost 1,000 in 68 and broke even with Willis Conover in 69. So the economic dreams that were feeding this festival were not paying off, and that's when they bring George Wein in. And in fact, Armstrong was booked to play for George Wein's New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, but he wasn't able to make it. Why would that be, Bjorn?
He was playing at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and on March 4th they made an agreement between George Wein and Louis to come to New Orleans and play April 24th. And just after the 2 weeks at Waldorf Astoria, he had to go to the hospital, and he was in there for 7 weeks and wasn't released until 6th of May. So he couldn't make the appearance in New Orleans.
And that would have been a reunion with Kid Ory, too,
yeah.
I think, at that. So there was a lot of sadness surrounding the fact that he couldn't make that gig.
And the Kid Ory was back in town for the first time in, I think it was 52 years.
It would have been quite an occasion. So we're going to wind it up. But there are still some things that Bjorn is working on. For example, this October 16th, 1944, Algiers Naval Repair Base. There's just one little document that sort of gives us an idea that Armstrong did a gig there, but that's all we know about it. So any historians who know Algiers history, please step forward. Bjorn would love to talk to you about that. And there are also some other questions that linger on after all this work, which simply means that we're going to continue to work on this for a while. All the keys to the city of New Orleans 4 times, who's got these keys? So Bjorn, I think you are pretty much dedicating your life to these research projects, if I'm not mistaken. But you've also dedicated a lot of your resources to the people coming up behind you. And so I just want to end at Bjorn's urging with this final slide. And the Hogan Jazz Archive Endowed Fund is not, it's a misnomer. In fact, it is the Bjorn Barnheim Research Fellowship. Thanks so much to Bjorn for making the resources available. We're giving out 5 of these fellowships this year. We have 2 recipients in the audience, and this is a great way to pay forward. Thank you, Bjorn. You're pretty much right on top.
Yeah. I can tell you another story. Last year, we showed a photo of Louis as King Zulu, together with his grandmother, Josephine, and an unnamed niece to Louis. Last December, a friend of mine came in Sweden and gave me a Swedish Yes magazine from May 1949 and said, there is a story about Armstrong. Maybe it's of interest for you. And I took the magazine, and then I was reading the story. It was written by Leonard Feather, who was in New Orleans during the Mardi Gras. And he referred to what he met people and so on. And suddenly in the text, he writes, when there were lunch break during the parade, Louis met his grandmother, Josephine Armstrong, who came together with his niece, Dorothy Armstrong. Now we have a
So
name.
we got the name.
I don't need to go to New Orleans to find it.
But you come anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you mind if Randy had a question? I'm wondering.
Sure.
If you might-
I noticed, I guess it's a comment rather than a question, or a little of both. On the ad for the Municipal Auditorium concert, I noticed at the bottom that the tickets were being sold. I think this is in 52. Was there a 52 concert at the Municipal, or the one
Yeah,
that didn't
52.
quite? Yeah. So at the bottom, the tickets are being sold at Frank's Record Store, 340 South Rampart Street, and at Werlein's. So it's a play to sell tickets to blacks, not just to the whites who would frequent Werlein's. So I think that little detail is expressive of his efforts.
It is, and segregation didn't mean that you couldn't have an audience composed of white and black people. It just meant they couldn't sit together.
Okay, one more.
I was just wondering, I recently found the footage. I was thinking about Super Bowls, and during some anniversary, I remembered I went to Super Bowl 4, and I looked back and, thinking about the show. Have you looked at that complete halftime show? It's fascinating, and musical scholars should look at it. And I'm wondering, was Louis Armstrong invited, or what was his health at that time? Or was he invited? I'd be very interested to know that. Al Hirt was the performer. Lionel Hampton was there. They did a whole history. They had the Southern or the Grambling Band, but there was plantation motif, and it's really my childhood
Bowl
summed
4.
up. Super Bowl 4.
That'd be worth looking
I
into.
found the video.
Yeah.
I can send you the link, and it's well worth looking at. But I'd
We'll
like to know
delve
if
into
Satchmo was
it.
invited. It would be interesting to know.
All right, ladies and gentlemen,
Thanks,
Bruce
everyone.
Rayburn and Bjorn Barnheim. We'll be back in a few minutes. We're going to change the stage around. We're going to have a little piano playing in the next presentation on Lil Hardin Armstrong. So stick around. Thank you again.
We have a